So I'm going to talk about how we got here. The people who had a vision of the future, how they shaped the computers we use today, and how they shaped Ruby. And talk a little bit about what Ruby's future might look like. We're here today because Yukihiro Matsumoto, aka Mats, I thought I saw him in the room. There he is. Hey. He was inspired to write a programming language. And his goal was programmer happiness, joy, and productivity. He was influenced by Perl, Smalltalk, Eiffel, Ada, and Lisp. And I'm going to focus mostly on Smalltalk because it had the biggest influence on Ruby. My story actually starts in 1968, December 9th to be specific. Something they later called the mother of all demos. It was in San Francisco at a joint computer conference, hardware and software. There were about 2,000 attendees. And the main presenter was Douglas Engelbart. He worked at Stanford Research Institute, SRI, on a project called the Augmented Human Intellect Research Center, the ARC, which had started in 1962. So they showed their vision of personal computing. They call it the online system, NLS, and it was very interactive. And computing at that time was mostly on mainframes, batch processing, and maybe some time sharing. But these were actually personal workstations. They introduced several innovations. The mouse, which they had invented in 1963. That thing on the left is a key quarter. You can actually hit any combination of the 5 keys at a time. That one didn't turn out to be very popular. And they used it mostly for like commands, like keyboard shortcut type of things. Networking. They mentioned that ARPANET is coming next year, probably. Video conference. They had actually had video conferencing going on, and they had a full screen interactive editor with copy and paste, collaborative editing. That was pretty amazing. And a shared screen. There were even multiple mouse cursors between like 35 miles away, 2 people communicating 35 miles away. And hyperlinks. They were clicking all through these hyperlinks and going back and forth. I highly recommend watching the video. Mother of all demos, Engelbart will get you there. There's like some 5-minute summaries. The whole video is in 3 parts. They're each about half an hour. So one person that was at the mother of all demos was Alan Kay. He had just gotten his bachelor degree in math and molecular biology. He was at graduate school at the University of Utah working on Sketchpad, which was the first computer graphics system, and Simulus 67, which was actually a little bit object-oriented. So a few months before that conference, he had this idea. And he drew this cartoon, actually in the fall of 1968. His original innovation was the idea of personal computers for children, and he was inspired by Logo Turtle graphics, which I guess already existed probably in Sketchpad. And if you see, he drew up it's a tablet with a keyboard. And 1969, Xerox opened the Palo Alto Research Center, PARC. That's in Silicon Valley, and Alan Kay joined them in 1970. A lot of people from SRI's Augmentation Research Center were there. A lot of people from Engelbart's lab. And PARC invented the laser printer, Ethernet, among other things. 1972 at PARC, there was a hallway discussion, and they were discussing how small could a message-based language be. And Alan Kay said, no more than a page of code, just like Lisp, right? And Dan Ingalls was a teammate of his, and he said, prove it. So he was inspired by Lisp and Smalltalk. He was inspired by Lisp and Stimula, and he wrote Smalltalk in 2 weeks. And then Dan Ingalls ran with it. He later was joined by Adele Goldberg, and they had 80 releases over the next 8 years, all internal to PARC. His main ideas were everything is an object. Objects communicate by sending and receiving messages. Objects have their own memory. Every object is an instance of a class, and classes hold shared behavior for all its instances. Pretty much what we know today as object-oriented programming. It was pretty primitive. Look at the code here. There's no real distinction between classes and instances. By the way, this UTF representation is accurate, except for they didn't have color. But they did have smiley faces in their code, so pretty weird. And you can kind of read some of this code, like if you replace 2 with def, logo used 2, and it kind of makes sense to make a square do this. The happy face was called Smiley, and it was an instance of a turtle class, so for graphics. It looks a little lispy with all those parentheses there. 1973, March 1st, Xerox introduced the Alto computer. The team called this the interim Dynabook. It was the size of a small refrigerator. It cost $32,000, which would be $200,000 today. It had 9K of RAM, 2.5 meg removable hard drive. The monitor had black and white pixels, about 500,000 of them, and it's in portrait orientation. It's Xerox. They know paper, right? That's how we use paper. It had a mouse. It came with a keycorder, but as you see here, not everyone was interested in using that. And it had a GUI with overlapping windows, icons, menus, pointers, and it had the first WYSIWYG editor. What you see is what you get. It was called Bravo. It was written by Charles Simoni, who later went on to write Microsoft Word. So Dan Ingalls kept improving on Smalltalk, and this was Smalltalk 76. It was 200 times faster than Smalltalk 72. It introduced blocks and keyword arguments, and it's starting to look a little like modern Smalltalk. Smalltalk 80 was the first public release. And if you see there, I've got select, collect, and inject, which are methods that Ruby actually has those, except we call them, I think we call them select still. Collect would be map, and inject would be reduce. August 1981, Byte magazine had a special issue dedicated to Smalltalk. It had 13 articles in the issue about Smalltalk and object-oriented programming. Quote here, a large number of the personal computers of tomorrow will be designed with the knowledge gained from the development of the Alto, but you probably won't be able to buy one. The first Smalltalk book came out in 1983 by Adele Goldberg. So Steve Jobs and Apple folks had visited PARC in 1979 a couple times. They paid Xerox in Apple stock options. Jobs was enamored with the GUI. He was shown Smalltalk 76, networking, and the mouse-driven GUI. What you see is what you get. He just paid attention to the GUI. He was just blown away with it, right? So that inspired the Lisa and the Macintosh. Jobs later said Xerox could have owned the entire computer industry. They could have been the IBM of the 90s. They could have been the Microsoft of the 90s. And in 1984, Alan Kay joined Apple. 1991, Perl 4 came out, written by Larry Wall. It was a more powerful scripting language than what existed on Unix, the Unix shell, sed, and awk. Usually if you're choosing a tool, you'll start with shell maybe and try sed, then try awk, and like, I need more power, so try Perl. It actually started in 1987, but it didn't really become popular until Perl 4. And his design philosophy, Larry Wall's design philosophy, was easy things should be easy and hard things should be possible. But they didn't have any objects until Perl 5 in 1994. To coincide with Perl 4 in 1991, they released the Programming Perl Camel book with Larry Wall and Randall Schwartz. That is still a popular book today. I think it's still O'Reilly's most popular book. So when Mats was thinking about Ruby, or creating his own programming language, he thought Perl was a toy language. And he thought Python, he felt like the object orientation was kind of bolted on, and I kind of agree with him there. So he wanted true object orientation. He wanted simple syntax, iterators, closures, exception handling, and garbage collection. And it didn't exist, so he created it. In February of 1993, he and a friend picked the name Ruby, which is shown there. That is a translation, though. It was not in English, it was in Japanese. So Ruby 0.95 came out in December of 1995, and he announced it on Japanese news groups. So now it's public. It's more than just a couple people that he knew directly working on it. 1996, Squeak came out. It's a more modern portable Smalltalk, written in Smalltalk, and it compiles to C, so that makes it very portable. It was done at Apple by Alan Kay and Dan Ingalls, and both of them soon moved to Disney, but it was open source, so they continued working on it at Disney. If you've ever used the Scratch visual programming language, it's built on top of Squeak. 1996, for a long time, this was my favorite Ruby book, even though it mentions zero Ruby. It's Design Patterns in the Small. It's written by Kent Beck. He wrote the book on test-driven development. He wrote the book on extreme programming. And he was later involved in the Agile Manifesto. 1996, Christmas Day, the first of many releases on Christmas Day, Ruby 1.0 was released. And Mats created the Ruby list, mailing list, in Japanese, so people could join. 1998, Ruby 1.2 was released, pretty much the first stable version. They added the true and false keywords. What were they using before? What were you using? I think you were using nil for false, and I guess anything else was truthy? Oh, capital true and false. Okay. And they added the or equals, which I love. I think it's one of the best, maybe an innovation of Ruby. 1999, the first Ruby book was published. It was written by Mats and Keiju Ishitsuka. It's in Japanese. The English translation of the title is The Object-Oriented Scripting Language Ruby. In 2000, there were 20 more Ruby books in Japanese. And by the end of 2000, Ruby's more popular in Japan than Perl or Python. December 15th of 2000, the Pickaxe book was released. See the cover has a pickaxe on it. The first English language book on Ruby. And it covered Ruby 1.6. It's written by Dave Thomas and Andy Hunt, the same folks that had written the Pragmatic Programmer book. Dave Thomas would also go on the next year to be part of the Agile Manifesto. So he was bringing his Agile practices to Ruby from the start. The latest 5th edition of this is for Ruby 3.3, written by Noel Rappin, who's giving a talk in another room. 2001, April 12th and 13th, the first International Ruby Conference was held in Tampa, Florida. It was organized by David Allen Black on the right, and Chad Fowler on the left, and also Dave Thomas. They later founded a nonprofit called Ruby Central to run future conferences, including this one. 2001, this is much earlier than I expected. JRuby came out. It's written by Jan Ann Peterson. It ran on the JVM, which made it faster, but more importantly, it could interact with JVM and its libraries. And if you're approved to use Java, you might be able to use any JVM language, honestly. Later, Charles Nutter and Thomas Anibo joined the project, and Charles Nutter is giving it, actually both of them are giving talks. Charles, they've both been working on this for 20 years, and Charles is going to talk about JRuby in that 20 years. 2003, Ruby 1.8 came out. This is kind of when it became mature, in my opinion. They added a lot of libraries: YAML, CSV, WebRick, OpenURL, OpenSSL, and test unit. Yay! So string interpolation was previously just for variables, and this version allowed any expression inside your curly braces inside a string. The enumerable inject was added. Again, that's from Smalltalk and later renamed Reduce. 2003, David Hannemeyer Hansen, DHH, built Basecamp for 37 signals. He had been previously coding in PHP and just found Ruby and used Ruby to build it. And he extracted the MVC web framework from Basecamp and released that in July of 2004. Ruby on Rails, first release. He marketed it really well. He had a 15-minute video building a blog app. And he was really fast with his text editor. He was using TextMate. He was blazingly fast at it. And people were like, how's he doing this so fast? It almost looked like he was cheating, but he was just really good with his editor. And this was Ruby's killer app, and it still is today, right? It was a big reduction in code versus Java web frameworks at the time. It used DSLs in metaprogramming to save a lot of code. And he uses convention over configuration. At the time, if you're writing a Java website, you had to spend like hundreds of lines of XML. It was just pretty awful. And this led to huge growth of the Ruby community. Also in 2004, the Groovy language came out, another JVM language. I was surprised to learn it's actually a superset of Java. So you can just do Java and then add some more concise stuff. And so it borrowed from Ruby, concise syntax, dynamic typing, closures, and metaprogramming. 2005, the first Rails book came out, again by Dave Thomas with DHH. This is where I learned Ruby and Rails. There was about 15 pages in the back of an appendix on here's what Ruby looks like. And I'm like, okay, I didn't know metaprogramming, but I could use Rails without having to worry about that for probably even a year. Note the title has Agile in it. Dave Thomas, once again, bringing Agile to our community. And the Rails 8 edition of this book is coming in 2025. 2007, I attended RailsConf. I think it was my second RailsConf. And Avi Bryant gave a talk called Smalltalk's Lessons for Ruby. So Avi had built the Seaside web framework in Smalltalk. He worked on the GemStore version of Smalltalk. And he was working on a Ruby virtual machine based on that gemstone called Maglev. So he talked about what lessons the Ruby community should learn from Smalltalk. His premise was that Ruby and Smalltalk are dialects of the same language. And I agree with that till today. He said Ruby could and should be faster. It should be as fast as Smalltalk because they're almost the same thing. And in fact, it should be as fast as Java because Java's virtual machine tech came from a Smalltalk research project called StrongTalk. So my takeaway in looking back now, Ruby was a rediscovery of Smalltalk. So Smalltalk is, a good thing, and it's pure object-oriented, and Mats wanted pure object-oriented, and he came up with almost the same thing, right? Syntax is just a little bit different. And I think, now that I look back, I think the Smalltalk community became the Ruby community. And so that played a large part, I think, in the way our community works. 2007, Ruby 1.9 came out. This was 3 years after Ruby 1.8. The longest between major releases. It included Yarv, yet another Ruby VM, which is faster. Stabby lambdas, nice little shorthand. Hash colons. So before this, you had to use hash rockets, which is the equal greater than. And there was even a company, I think it still exists today, called HashRocket, a Ruby company. All right, they do. So this is a compatibility nightmare, though. Gems didn't work with each other. I think there was even an ABI change between 1.90 and 1.91. I think that's what provoked Bundler. And it took till 2011 to release 1.9.3, which finally had stability. And we used 1.9.3 quite a while. 2008, fork of Squeak called Pharaoh was released. Their goal is to revisit the design of Smalltalk and enhance it. So this is probably the most modern version of Smalltalk. And it's based on an open Smalltalk VM that is shared between several other Smalltalks. 2008, Rubinius was released by Evan Phoenix, mostly written in Ruby, while MRI, Matz's Ruby interpreter, was mostly C. Looked promising, but it's now been abandoned. Josie Vilim in 2012 released Elixir, a functional programming language built on the Erlang VM. He had been on the Rails core team, and he even had a book, Crafting Rails Applications. So it's Erlang, but with cleaner syntax, mostly borrowed from Ruby. It scales very well from embedded devices to large clusters, distributed systems. It'll run 1 million threads on a 16-core machine. Because it's built on Erlang, it's got great fault tolerance as well. Truffle Ruby came out in 2013. It's a fork of JRuby on the Graal JIT and virtual machine. Those are also from Oracle, just like the normal JVM, so I don't know what the difference is, and I don't know why they haven't combined yet. 2013, Ruby 2.0 and 2.1 came out. Since 2.1, every release has been yearly on Christmas Day. And they added a lot of refinements. Mods talked about those a little bit. And I didn't even know that we had rational literals with // 2014, Crystal language came out. It's effectively compiled Ruby. You lose some metaprogramming. You have to use macros instead. They're not as clean. It's typed, but you don't have to do a lot of type hinting. The main thing is if you have an empty array, you have to tell it an empty array of what kind of thing am I going to be putting in there. And does a great job of nil checking, so you don't have any nils at runtime error, or nil errors at runtime. Eliminates an entire class of bugs, which is awesome. And it's fast because it's compiled, and it has a pretty good community and libraries. I actually gave a talk on this at a local user group, I think in 2014, 2015. Rust came out in 2015. It's very fast, memory efficient, low level, embedded. It has the concept of a bar checker. So you own, only one thread can own a mutable variable. If you just went to the Raptors talk, that's kind of the problem with concurrency. So again, it's eliminating another whole class of bugs. And it borrowed a lot of things, of ideas from Ruby, and quite a few other languages. But a lot of Ruby developers went and started using Rust instead of C, at least. Ruby 2.3 came out with the safe navigation operator. Mods calls it the lonely operator because it looks like a person sitting and looking at the period. That was borrowed from Groovy, actually, as far as I understand. Groovy uses question mark period, but we have question marks at the end of variable names or method names, so that couldn't use it. One of my favorite things in Ruby, dig through nested arrays and hashes, and started the performance improvements. This is when the 3x3 performance goal was started, and I'll talk about that just a little bit more. The first JIT came with Ruby 2.6. mJIT was experimental. We also started including bundler with Ruby. We got some function composition operators, and then to chain methods like pipes in Unix shell, or that actually probably came more from Elixir. Elixir has a triangle operator for piping, and it can clean up your code, as you can see on the screen. Ruby 2.7 in 2019 added pattern matching, borrowed from Elixir with the case in. Who's using pattern matching? All right, about a third of the people, I think. And numbered block parameters. So you can use _1, so you don't have to give a name to your parameters in a block. And lots of internal cleanups. Ruby 3.0, the 3x3 performance improvements. The goal was to make Ruby 3.0 3 times faster than Ruby 2.0. And most of this was adding a just-in-time compiler. They also add the single-line method definition, which I'm really digging because most of my methods are one line, and I like to keep it that way. And that Raptors were introduced experimentally. Apparently, they're still working on that to make them really good. Static analysis, and one-line pattern matching. Ruby 3.1 added shorthand for hash and keyword arguments. So if you want to say x:x, just say x:, and it'll figure out that you meant x. The YJIT was added, yet another JIT. We finally got a new standard debugger. IRB added autocomplete, some more pattern matching, and a type profiler that reads plain Ruby and generates your RBS type signature file. Ruby 3.2 added the data class. Is anyone using the data class? I really enjoy the data class. It's similar to struct, but it's for value objects that are immutable, and there's no setters. And I like the way that I like immutable objects. So this I learned WebAssembly. You can actually output to WebAssembly. And the YJIT was rewritten from C to Rust, and it was stable. I don't know how they rewrote something and got it stable in a year. Pretty impressive. Ruby 3.3 came out last year on Christmas Day. The Prism parser was also introduced. It's not the default yet, but it is an option. And yet another JIT, RJIT, which is in pure Ruby. and some more IRB improvements. So this Christmas, Prism is going to be the default parser. And instead of _1, we can use it. And you're like, well, doesn't RSpec use it? Well, there were warnings in Ruby 3.3, and it actually handles all those existing uses because any existing use of it would be a method that takes an argument or a block. So this is just a bare it. We don't have to freeze our strings anymore. Hopefully in Ruby 3.5, maybe they'll automatically be frozen. But mutating string literals is deprecated now. Let's see. Oh, and I just learned today, namespacing was supposed to make it a 3.4, but got postponed. So where are we at in Ruby today? Ruby's still innovating incrementally. It gets new features, new implementations, new libraries. Features are added later than most of us. Features are added faster than most of us can keep up with them. There's over 30 implementations of Ruby, I was surprised to find out. Not all still in working function. But the community is learning how to use the features better over time. We learned how to use metaprogramming, and then we learned how not to overdo metaprogramming. And I've seen that in the community as well as individuals. It's interesting. The community is still strong. We got RubyConf, RubyCyg, regional conferences. And one of the things I wanted to answer for myself was, why did Smalltalk lose to C++? I don't think it did. I think the Ruby community became, the Smalltalk community became the Ruby community. And C++ and Ruby have the same number of conferences today. So Ruby has a lot of strengths. Motz's focus on developer happiness includes simplicity, readability, expressiveness, syntax that reads like pseudocode. The dynamic nature gives us fast feedback loop with no type annotations. I think it was just object-oriented and a little bit of FP at the right time. And Motz is nice, so we are nice. So Ruby's alive and well. It's generated probably $1 trillion of value in commercial companies, and it will continue to adapt. So I think it's got a pretty bright future. And a lot of Rubyists have worked in other languages, joined communities, and brought back their ideas to Ruby and taken Ruby's ideas to those other languages. So I highly recommend these talks for some great ideas for Ruby features. So go learn some other languages. It'll make you a better Ruby programmer. So let's help invent the future. Experiment with some language features, steal from other languages, add them to Ruby, find ways to help the Ruby maintainers, get involved in the community for an upcoming language or Ruby. You can shape their libraries and shape their tools. That's kind of fun. So have fun and find what brings you joy. Thank you.